right. Hello, and welcome to the third edition of Kevin's Novel Ideas. As you can tell by that little musical intro, today we're going to be talking about time and a book I recently read called When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing by Daniel Pink. I found this book very interesting. I mean, time is something we're always looking at. Clocks are everywhere. From where I sit, I could see three clocks in my house. Seems like we're always trying to beat the clock, create more time, be more efficient. And so I think to kind of take a little bit of a deep dive into time and think about how we interact with it, and kind of this book focuses on some key strategies for kind of making time work for you maybe a little bit better. I'm the kind of guy who shows up at the airport at least a couple hours early. My theory is that extra hour you're trying to sneak sleep or doing something else could be very costly on that day more than others. So I always kind of do a when I think of time coming from a accounting economics background, I always kind of equate time and money and kind of look at it and say, okay, if I get an extra half an hour of sleep, but lose, $800 for missing my flight, or get my vacation delayed, it's just not worth it. And I do that a lot of times in relation to time. I like to respect the time of others also, so that's why I like to be kind of early. Time is one of the only things you can't really buy more of. So coming in a capitalistic society, you can pretty much buy more of anything that you want, but you can never buy more time. So again, that kind of creates an interesting dynamic in relation to time. And since I've retired, I've noticed that what I've really gotten was the time, and I equate time and freedom in this regard to do anything that I want. Some who retired are more worried about what they would do with all that additional time, but it's interesting. I don't necessarily worry about that. I more think, wow, I can do whatever I want with my time. Where before since you were a kid, you've always kind of been scheduled either with school or work in regards to, a good portion of your time. So that's kind of why I was interested in this topic. I'm a real believer of being in the right place at the right time. I think timing is important ingredient in success. Clearly, hard work and persistent are important, but I've experienced and I've seen others in my life being in the right place at the right time, and sensing the opportunity and taking advantage of that is a big part of, from getting married to changing careers to getting that promotion. Thus, I thought it would be interesting to share a new book that I've read about time. And as I've mentioned, the book is called When: The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. As we all sort of know, that a lot of that timing that I just mentioned is somewhat out of our control and random. If you buy into the stock market on the wrong days, you can get some pretty bad returns. That's why people tend to do what they call dollar cost averaging, which is kind of put in money slowly over time, because it's depending on which day you would invest in, your returns would vary a lot. So without having control of what the stock market does, by dollar cost averaging, you're going to get a better return. If you have a great idea, but you're ahead of your time, it might not catch on. Many great artists die poor, but their works are now worth millions. Again, having to do with timing and things like that. If you didn't miss your regular train on a certain day, you might have never sat next to your future partner. So I've always kind of been fascinated with time and how we interact with time, and how it affects our daily lives. So that's kind of why I read this book. So let me get into it, and I'll read you a little bit of the introduction here that Daniel cited. So in chapter 1, the introduction, this is a book about timing. We all know that timing is everything. Trouble is, we don't know much about timing itself. Our lives present a never-ending stream of when decisions, when to change careers, deliver bad news, schedule a class, end a marriage, go for a run, or get serious about a project or a person. But most of these decisions emanate from a steamy bog of intuition and guesswork. Timing, we believe, is an art. So Daniel, as we'll get into here, for the last 2 years, he said, two intrepid researchers and I analyzed and read over 700 studies in the fields of economics, anesthesiology, anthropology, endocrinology, chronobiology, and social psychology to unearth the hidden science of timing. So that's kind of interesting, wide span of disciplines, and I kind of like books that kind of look at the whole research and kind of consolidate it for you so you can kind of understand it and kind of tell you interesting stories around it rather than reading dry studies. So often I am attracted to books like that. He goes on to say, you'll soon realize that much of what we assume are natural units of time are really fences our ancestors constructed in order to corral time. Seconds, hours, and weeks are all human inventions. Only by marking them off, wrote historian Daniel Boorenstein, would mankind be liberated from the cynical monotony of nature. So that's kind of an interesting element too. I've always, from Einstein saying that, everything is happening all at once, not to get into multidimensional and deep science here, but there was a movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once, I believe it was called. And it seems like this is more in the zeitgeist in regards to kind of the quantum physics of it. But time is really a human construct, or it doesn't really exist in science, which I've always kind of found interesting to think about, but I can never quite wrap my mind around it. So that's kind of the basis for what this book is going to be about. It's going to look at all these different ways to consider time, how to best use it in your life. So in chapter 1, which is called The Hidden Pattern of Everyday Life, the author goes on to describe, since 3 centuries ago, scientists have established that nearly all living things, from single-cell organisms that lurk in ponds to multicellular organisms that drive minivans, us, have biological clocks. So we're not the only organism with biological clocks. They're all over nature, right? These internal timekeepers play an essential role in proper functioning. They govern a collection of what we call circadian rhythms, which I think we're all familiar with, from the Latin circa, meaning around, and diem, meaning day. So now you can impress people with your knowledge of Latin. That's it, the daily backbeat of every creature's life. The result is that human beings metaphorically open and close at regular times during the day, sort of like other parts of nature, like plants that open and close during various times of the day. So researchers have looked into this, and he goes on to say they have found a consistent and strong bimodal pattern, twin peaks during the day. So human beings have 2 kind of peaks during the day. The woman's positive effect climbed in the morning hours until it reached an optimal emotional point around midday. Then good mood quickly plummeted and stayed low throughout the afternoon, only to rise again in the early evening. So we rise and shine by the sun, but we also have, he posits that based upon research, we also have different peaks in the day, which sort of makes common sense to me. I usually like to take a nap after lunch. I like to start off, actually I'm recording this podcast early in the day because I seem to be stronger in that day. So within the day, there are regular patterns. I mean, we can use these to our advantage or ignore them to our detriment. Some of this we may inherently realize, but never really have given a lot of thought. And there's been a lot of research into this, and I think it's important to kind of be aware of it and kind of use it to your advantage. So there's another piece that deals with that. In a published article in Science magazine, Macy and Golder found there was a remarkably consistent pattern across people's waking hours. Positive effect, language revealing they were looking at people tweeting and the nature of the tweets. So they categorized tweets as negative or positive, and then they looked at the timing of the day that the tweets were posted on Twitter or X. So positive effect, language revealing that tweets felt active, engaged, and hopeful, generally rose in the morning, plummeted in the afternoon, and climbed back up again in the early evening. Whether a tweeter was North American or Asian, Muslim or atheist, black or white, didn't matter. The temporal effect is similarly shaped across disparate cultures and geographic regions. Nor did it matter whether they were tweeting on Monday or Thursday. Each weekday was basically the same. Weekends results differed slightly. Positive effect was generally a bit higher on Saturdays and Sundays. That makes sense, right? People aren't working. And the morning peak began 2 hours later because people were sleeping in than on weekdays. But the overall shape that stayed the same. Whether they were measured in a large, diverse country like the United States or smaller, homogeneous countries like the United Arab Emirates, the daily pattern was the same. So this means we're generally, when we wake up, more positive earlier in the day. And then, the pattern, as the day goes on, we become less positive, which is kind of interesting. And possibly, thinking about it, I hadn't thought about it to this point. You could say maybe it relates to work because you start work, you encounter difficulties, problems, issues, and then you become less positive. And then when the day ends, you get re-energized as you get home, have dinner, greet your friends and family, whatever you do at the end of the day. But interestingly enough, they found the same patterns on the weekends. So it's kind of interesting, and I think it's kind of important to note things like that. So there's various stories that he tells. So let me relate one in regards to a woman named Linda, and let me read a little bit about the book about Linda. So meet Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. In college, Linda majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Before I tell you more about Linda, let me ask you a question. So this is in the book. Which is more likely? Now think about this. Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement, based upon what we heard about Linda being deeply concerned about issues of discrimination and social justice. Faced with this question, researchers have found most people, let me pause to give you a chance to answer. So which is more likely? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller is active in the feminist movement? Most people would answer B, that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. It makes intuitive sense, right? A justice-seeking anti-nuke philosophy major. That sure sounds like someone who would be an active feminist. But A is and must be the correct response. The answer isn't a matter of fact. Linda isn't real. So, just to explain this, for Linda to be a bank teller is one thing, and for Linda to be a bank teller and active in the feminist movement is two things. So Linda first has to be a bank teller which is answer A, before you could get to answer B. So there could be a million Lindas, and if one is just a bank teller and not active in the movement, then that would be the more likely answer. The interesting thing is, as he goes on, when researchers have posed the Linda problem at different times of day, for instance at 9 a.m. and at 8 p.m. in a well-known experiment, timing often predicted whether participants arrived at the correct answer or slipped on a cognitive banana peel. People were much more likely to get it right earlier in the day than later. There was one intriguing and important exception to the findings, which he discusses later. But as with executives on earnings call, performance was generally strong in the beginning of the day, then worsened as the hours ticked by. The same pattern held for stereotypes. Research asked other participants to assess the guilt of a fictitious criminal defendant. All the jurors read the same set of facts, but for half of them, the defendant's name was Robert Garner, and the other half, it was Roberto Garcia. When people made their decisions in the morning, there was no real difference in guilty verdicts between the two defendants. However, when they rendered their verdicts later in the day, they were much more likely to believe that Garcia was guilty and Garner was innocent. For this group of participants, mental keenness, as shown by rationally evaluating evidence, was greater early in the day. And mental squishiness, as evidenced by resorting to stereotypes, increased as the day wore on. These fluctuations are more extreme than we realize. The performance change between the daily high point and the daily low point can be equivalent to the effect on the performance of drinking the legal limit of alcohol. So I think we all kind of know, I mean, for most of us, and we'll get into night owls and early risers and whatnot, but I think we all kind of realize when we're fresher in the day, we're more analytically aware. And in these two research cases, they kind of proven that. And the effect, which I found kind of the most surprising, that is it's a very strong effect. It's not a weak effect. So if we're, for instance, having a meeting in the morning and we're requiring people to think more analytically, or if we're having a meeting and it requires analytical thinking, I would suggest that we all think about having that sort of early in the morning. That's when people are going to be more analytical and not. But the converse thing is, and I'll jump to that, is that later in the day, when we're, as he pointed out, a little bit more mentally squishy, it's actually the creative and intuitive part that comes out better. So if you're looking for people to be creative and maybe whiteboard ideas and blue sky things, you're better off scheduling the meeting later in the day, because the analytical part won't be as strong, but people will be more open to new ideas, which I kind of found interesting. And I sort of thought about it a little bit more and kind of related it to maybe rock stars and poets and inventors. You always hear these anecdotal stories, and as you read bibliographies and biographies, autobiographies, about people, you kind of realize that a lot of the stuff creatively and the aha moments occur late at night. And so that's kind of interesting to think about that. So again, maybe some of this is intuitive to you. Maybe you've known it, but the research actually shows it's a strong effect. And I would contend that people may have a soft awareness of it, but to be able to use it in your daily life and to be aware of it consciously, I think will help you deal with timing in many ways. So I kind of found all that pretty interesting. So there are optimal times to do things. And there are optimal times within the day. So that's, it might make sense to schedule creative pursuits at non-optimal times, like late at night. Maybe that's why rock stars record it, at 2 a.m. So you may ask yourself, well, we are all different. And so you're right. We have early risers. We have people who are night owls, and they call that in the time industry chronotypes. So that's another interesting word that you can use, what my chronotype is. So basically the research over several decades and across different continents found that between 60 and 80% of us are third birds. So there are definitely different types of birds. There are the human beings don't all experience a day in precisely the same way, he says. Each of us have a chronotype, a personal pattern of circadian rhythms that influence our physiology and psychology. The Edisons among us are late chronotypes, as I sort of mentioned, the inventors. They wake long after sunrise to test mornings and don't begin peaking until late afternoon or early evening. Others of us are early chronotypes. I would put myself as an early chronotype that rise easily and feel energized during the day but wear out by evening. Some of us are owls, other of us are larks. He goes on to say, according to research, 60 to 80% of us are third birds. It's like feet. Some people are born with big feet and some with small feet, but most people are somewhere in the middle. So between the kind of strong early risers and the late night owls, 68 or 60 to 80% of us kind of fall within the middle. There's not much we could do about their size or shape, similar to feet. We are kind of, genetics explains at least half the variability in chronotype. So if you've always been a night owl and you want to be an early riser, that's going to be a tough haul because they have found genetics determine, almost 50%. So this suggests that larks and owls are born, not necessarily made. In fact, the when of one's birth plays a surprisingly powerful role. People born in the fall, now this is something I wasn't aware of. People born in the fall and winter are more likely to be larks. Interesting. People born in the spring and summer are more likely to be owls. Now, I don't have here why that is, but I was born in the winter and I'm a lark. So that holds for me. I don't know if it holds for you or not, but I found that interesting. In brief, and it also varies by where you are at your life. In high school and college, people are disproportionately owls, just as people over 60 and under 12 are disproportionately larks. So you can change over time. There's that swing in the middle, so that those third birds, let's say during high school and college, they may swing more towards the owl side, and then later in life they may swing more towards the lark side. But I think strong owls and strong larks tend to stay that way throughout their life, and I've found that to be the case for myself. I would generally consider myself a lark, as I said. Men are generally owlier than women, so men stay up later, which is kind of the opposite of my relationship with my wife. Yet, regardless of age or gender, most people are neither strong larks nor strong owls. Nonetheless, in short, all of us experience the day in three stages: a peak, a trough, and a rebound. And about 3/4 of us, larks and thunderbirds, experience it in that order. But about 1 in 4 people, those whose genes or age make them night owls, experience the day in something closer to the reverse order. Recovery, so when you wake up, you're recovering, need caffeine, get a slow start, takes you a while to get going, then the trough. So you start with recovery, then the trough, then the peak later in the day, towards the evening or late at night. So I found that interesting too, that you start with the recovery. It seems to make sense, the trough and then the peak. Now, what those people do in a 9 to 5 world, I don't know. I think that's kind of maybe why they don't necessarily fit in the 9 to 5 world. They might be the more creative types. Kind of interesting to think about that. And the research kind of supports that. So it's important to figure out your type, understand your task, and then select the appropriate time of day for what you plan on doing. If you don't let it be at random, you can use time to your advantage. And that's kind of what I said from the beginning. Things happen sort of randomly, but we can, acknowledge our strengths and weaknesses and kind of be more aware of, because even in my job, I wouldn't have thought of, okay, this is an important meeting where we're going through numbers. We need everyone to be fresh. You kind of just look at everyone's calendar and schedule the meeting, right? Rather than say, I really want this meeting at 9 or 10 in the morning because I think I'm going to get a better result for it. Or conversely, I want something, I need some creative input. Maybe it's better to schedule it later in the day when people might be more open-minded to things. Now may be saying, I guess I've known this and may have used it to your advantage, but how often do you schedule that meeting or task randomly or not consciously? Which is kind of what I said. Um, so the book goes on and talks about, and this is another sense. So not only yourself, but let's look at a situation where you're going to the hospital for a procedure. So come, and this is in chapter 2, afternoons and coffee spoons, he calls it. Come with me for a moment into the hospital of doom. At this hospital, patients are 3 times more likely than at other hospitals to receive a potentially fatal dose of anesthesia and considerably more likely to die within 48 hours of surgery. Gastroenterologists here find fewer polyps during colonoscopies than their more scrupulous colleagues, so cancerous growths go undetected. Internists are 26% more likely to prescribe unnecessary antibiotics for viral infections, thereby fueling the rise of drug-resistant superbugs. And throughout the facility, nurses and other caregivers are nearly 10% less likely to wash their hands before treating patients, increasing the probability that patients will contract an infection in the hospital they didn't have when they entered. If I were a medical malpractice lawyer, and I'm thankful that I'm not, I'd hang out a single across the street from such a place. If I were a husband and parent, and I'm thankful that I am, I wouldn't let any member of my family walk through this hospital's doors. And if I were advising you on how to navigate your life, which for better or for worse I'm doing in these pages, I'd offer the following counsel. Stay away. The Hospital of Doom may not be your real name, but it is a real place. Everything I've described is what happens in the modern medical centers during the afternoons compared with the mornings. I think you kind of might have saw where that was heading based upon our discussion before, but this was sort of I kind of knew, again, through my economics medical background, I kind of knew a little bit about medical errors and things like that, but never really understood how strong the evidence was for the timing of things like this. So here, the trial, as he goes on, the trial was especially treacherous. Adverse events were significantly more frequent for cases starting during the 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. hours. The probability of a problem at 9 a.m. was about 1%. At 4 p.m., 4.2%. So if you're having that surgery or some important medical treatment, schedule it in the morning, even if you have to do a couple days later or whatnot, because, a 4 times factor, even though the percentages may appear small, is very significant. In other words, the chance of something going awry while someone is delivering drugs to knock you unconscious was 4 times greater during the trial than the peak. For example, one off-cited study of more than 1,000 colonoscopies found that endoscopists are less likely to detect polyps, small growths on the colon, as the day progresses. Every hour that passed resulted in a nearly 5% reduction in polyp detection. Further, for every 10 times they wash your hands in the morning, medical personnel do so 6 times in the afternoon. So getting out of the workplace and meetings and your life, when you're scheduling medical appointments, time is very critical. I don't know if they schedule operations early in the morning now. Now, this is even factoring in that, owl and lark thing. So you could presume that some doctors may be owls, which would make them they'd be in recovery mode in the morning, and maybe better later in the day. But even with those effects, this research really indicates that you should schedule your appointments for medical procedures later in the morning. So you can thank me for bringing that up to you when all your surgeries go well, which I hope they do. So afternoons can be deadly behind the white walls of the hospital. In the United Kingdom, sleep rated beyond Sleep-related vehicle accidents peak twice during 24-hour period. One is between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., so the middle of the night, so that kind of makes sense, right? You don't want to necessarily be driving, in the middle of the night, especially if you're not a night owl. And the other is between 2 and 4 p.m., the middle of the afternoon. Research has found the same pattern of traffic accidents in the United States, Israel, Finland, France, and other countries. Another thing I wouldn't have thought of, but I think we all experience the afternoon doldrums. I think people run out to Starbucks. It would be interesting to see if that research shows that they have, not only in the morning but in the afternoon, kind of rush on coffee for a coffee break. But vehicle accidents show that between 2 and 4 p.m. there's many more accidents than you would actually consider. I remember, taking breaks, going for walks after lunch, and, will all increase our productivity. I think research has found that. Again, maybe we kind of know this, but often we fall into the pattern and, we say we don't have the time for a walk or a nap or to get a breath of fresh air. We're tied to our desks. In fact, it shows people who eat at their desk are actually less productive because they're not getting that break. Again, maybe intuitive things that we've heard throughout time, but research has really shown this to be the case, and that we should be very aware of this as we go through our day. And saying that we don't have time is actually counterproductive, because we will actually be more productive and create more time for ourselves by taking these breaks. And I've always been a big believer in that. So this also applies to not only hospitals, but they also looked at within the court system. So it goes on in that same chapter. He goes on, in 2011, 3 social scientists, 2 Israelis and 1 American, used data from 2 parole boards to examine judicial decision making. They found that in general, judges were more likely to issue a favorable ruling, granting the prisoner parole or allowing them to remove an ankle monitor in the morning than in the afternoon. But look what happens after the judges take a break. Immediately after their first break for lunch, they become more forgiving, more willing to deviate from the default. Maybe they were hangry before lunch, and then after lunch they felt satiated and therefore more forgiving, as it says. And then so they peak right after lunch, more forgiving after the break, and then as the day wears on, they become again more hardline in their attitude after a few hours. Ponder the consequences. If you happen to appear before a parole board just before a break rather than just after one, you'll likely spend a few more years in jail. Not because of the facts of the case, because of the time of the day. So between, the hospitals, so it's the hospitals and now the judicial system, getting your appointment or your parole board hearing, God forbid, or any hearing, if you go in before a judge for a traffic violation or whatever, try to get in early in the morning or right after lunch. Otherwise, evidence has shown that time makes a difference in these things. So researchers have found that high performers, in conclusion, work for 52 minutes and then take a break for 17 minutes. So what is that? About 15% of the time you should be on break, which I think we all like that. So, when you're napping at your desk, and I'll relate a story from early in my career. I got out of college and we worked late nights. My wife loves to tell this because she was working with me at the same time. This was my first job out of college. I was with Price Waterhouse, a big accounting firm, and was working on my first engagement. We were at a client's office. I was in the audit unit, so we would go out and review the financial records late into the night, and there were deadlines because they needed to issue the financial statement. So first big job, we're working late at night, we're working weekends, and I guess I didn't realize it, but my wife said most of my cubicle was sort of at the end of all the other people working on the engagement, and I was facing in one direction, and they would watch me fall asleep, fall asleep during the day. Now this is my first job, right? Um, right out of college, and so my boss or my seniors in the engagement, the managers, would all. She said they would joke about me taking naps and whatever, but they also realized that I was a high performer. So they never I never knew it. No one ever said anything to me except my wife, who joked about it, years later, after I was no longer working there, and she told me this story, and so I kind of related to what the research has found. High performers do take breaks. Now, I don't necessarily recommend napping on your job at your first professional engagement in front of, 15 or other more colleagues and maybe the client too. Uh, I don't know how many people could get away with that, but maybe take a walk or close your office door or go someplace. In fact, I think my previous employer actually, in their new building, had a nap and meditation room. So I think companies have kind of gotten onto this, that um, working all the time and not paying attention to the importance of refreshing yourself is key to productivity. And I think employers have sort of realized that. So that ends one part of the book. And then the book kind of goes into, so that's more the rhythm of the days and kind of our natural chronotypes, and trying to be aware of that and sort of using time to your advantage based upon what we know the research has shown. So the other one of the other focuses, and there's much more to this book, and I recommend that you read it if you're in any way interested in the topic. I'm just kind of picking and choosing, kind of disparate here a little bit. Hopefully you're following along. Topics to talk about that I found interesting, but there's plenty else in the book that you can find interesting too, and I found the book really helpful to think about these things. But one other point they bring out is that as far as time goes, beginnings matter a lot. And we've always kind of had that, first impressions matter and things like that. But research has shown beginnings matter a lot, and so do endings. Ironically, most of our focus is on that massive time in the middle, because that's where most of the time is. But if we pay attention to beginnings and endings, the time in the middle becomes less important. So open strong and end strong, and pay attention to when you start things and end things. For instance, and I think I'm going to bring up another book here because I found it interesting at the time. If you ever read, I believe it was Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, he talks about athletes, right? Professional athletes, athletes that do really well. There's a finding that those who were born sort of, I don't know how to describe this, but we all start school at a certain time, right? So those who were older than their classmates, right, who hit the cutoff, right at the beginning of the cutoff, so that they were older than their classmates, and thus when they were doing organized sports were a little bit older than the others in their group, even though it couldn't have been more than a year, could have been 11 months, 29 days, but typically would average to 6 to 7 months, one would think. They do better not only then, but throughout their careers. So just the matter of being born at a certain time would give you an advantage, having nothing to do with your inherent talents or anything. Just being the date you were born would give you a statistically significant advantage over other people. I always find that those kind of things interesting, and as I said in the beginning, that's out of your control and random, but Oh, there was a term here. I just saw it. They call, sleeping a nappuccino. So tell your boss you're taking a nappuccino. I'm going to go out for a nappuccino. So in regards to beginnings and endings, this is chapter 3, talks about beginnings. There are 3 principles of successful beginnings, he says. Start right, start again, and start together. As he explained in chapter 1, young people begin undergoing the most profound change in chronobiology of their lifetime around puberty. They fall asleep later in the evening and, left to their own biological imperatives, wake up later in the morning. A period of peak owlness that stretches into our early 20s, for example. Unfortunately, high schools and colleges schedule classes early in the morning. So the evidence of harm of scheduling those is large. He goes on to say the evidence of harm is so massive that in 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a policy statement calling for middle schools and high schools to begin no earlier than 8:30 a.m. A few years later, the CDC added its voice, concluding that delaying school start times has the potential for the greatest population impact in boosting teenage learning and well-being. Yet, how many schools, I think he goes through in the book, noting that certain school districts have done it, but how many schools still start the day early? Why they do it? It's convenient for the adults, but it's hampering the learning and well-being of the students, which should be the ultimate objective, right? In fact, a study of university students, he points out, in both the United States and United Kingdom concludes that the optimal time for most college classes is after 11 a.m. So this is even taking in, well, the fact that, people at that age are more, more owls, just at that time in their life. Yet the pleas of nation's pediatricians and top health officials, as well as the experience of schools that have challenged the status quo, has been largely ignored, he points out. And as I mentioned, the resistance is coming from parents and teachers, most likely. So if they really cared about the kids, start class later in the day, like 9, 10 maybe. In college, 11 or later. That would be a good thing. So another interesting thing, and I'll just cover the beginnings here, is he goes through 4 situations where you should go first and 4 situations where you should not go first. So again, focusing on beginnings here. So 4 situations where you should go first. If you're on the ballot, being listed first gives you an edge. Researchers study this effect in thousands of elections, from school board to city council, from California to Texas, and consistently voters preferred the first name on the ballot. If you're not the default choice, number 2, if you're not the default choice, for example, if you're pitching against a firm that has the account you're seeking, going first can help you get a fresh look from the decision makers. So if you're pitching a firm that already has somebody there, going first can get you a fresh look. So do that. If there are really few competitors, say 5 or few, and you're pitching in a sales meeting, going first can help you take advantage of primacy effect, the tendency people have to remember the first thing in a series better than those that come later. However, if you're interviewing for a job and you're up against several strong candidates, you might gain an advantage from being first to interview. There was an examination of more than 9,000 MBA admission interviews and found that interviewers often engage in narrow bracketing, assuming small sets of candidates represent the entire field. So if they encounter several strong applicants early in the process, they might more aggressively look for flaws in the later ones. So all those cases, it would be an advantage to go first. In a ballot, most cases where you have, if you're unknown to somebody and you're pitching something, you want to go early rather than later to make a fresh impression in their mind. And interviews where there's fewer competitors. So conversely, 4 situations when you don't want to go first, Judges are more likely to stick with the default later in the day, when they're fatigued rather than early or after a break. If there are many competitors, not necessarily strong ones, just a larger number of them, going later can confer a small advantage, and going last can confer a huge one. In a study of more than 1,500 live idol performances in 8 countries, researchers found that the singer who performed last advanced to the next round roughly 90% of the time. An almost identical pattern occurs in elite figure skating and even in wine tasting. So, lots of choices, many different options, and not much distinction between the two. Go later and last, preferably. As the competition proceeds, a new, more realistic baseline develops, which favors later competitors who gain the added advantage of seeing what the others have done. If you're operating in an uncertain environment, not being first can work to your benefit. If you don't know what the decision maker expects, letting others proceed could allow the criteria to sharpen into focus both for the selector and you. And if the competition is meager, going toward the end can give you an advantage by highlighting your differences. If it was a weekday with many bad candidates, it's a really good idea to go last. So it's all situational, but being aware of these things and then trying to position yourself in the order based upon this knowledge can really, again, use time to your advantage. And then the same thing kind of goes for endings, right? As I mentioned, he points out in Chapter 5, for example, to run a marathon, participants must register with race organizers, include their age. They found that 9-enders, people like 29, 39, 19, overrepresented first-time marathoners by a whopping 48%. Across the entire lifespan, the age at which people were most likely to run their first marathon was 29. 29-year-olds were about twice as likely to run a marathon as 28-year-olds and 30-year-olds. What does this have to do with endings? You're reaching kind of the end of that decade, and so you're like, I'm going to do this now before I get to 30, which sort of makes sense. However, flipping life's odometers to a 9 doesn't always trigger healthy behavior. They also discovered that the suicide rate was higher among 9-enders than among people whose ages ended in any other digit. So apparently was the propensity of men to cheat on their wives. On the extramarital affair website Ashley Madison, nearly 1 in 8 men were 29, 39, 49, 59, and 18% higher than the chance would predict. Now, I just thought about that as I was reading that. I don't think I read that line before. I would say that's not necessarily their age. I think people tend to lie about their age. You know, the joke is I'm, 29 until I'm 60 or whatever. So I think people who are in their mid-30s will lie at 29. People who are in the mid-40s or 50s will lie at 39. And so that's why there might be a higher propensity. I don't necessarily think people who are 29 are necessarily cheating on their spouses more. Doesn't seem... I kind of buy it with the marathon and possibly the suicide, because that sort of makes sense to me that if you're reviewing your life, you're like, oh, it's another decade. For whatever reason, you might be more depressed about it or whatnot, that you hadn't accomplished something. Oh, possibly maybe for the extramarital. But I would think that the lying about the age is a higher factor. Anyways, likewise, in other studies, people given a hard deadline, a date, and a time are more likely to sign up to be organ donors than those for whom the choice is open-ended. People with a gift certificate valid for 2 weeks are 3 times more likely to redeem it than people with the same certificate valid for 2 months. Negotiators with a deadline are far more likely to reach an agreement than those without a deadline, and the agreement comes disproportionately at the very end of the allotted time. So endings matter, setting deadlines, getting people focused, I guess, in regards to the gift certificate and things like that. People pay attention to ends of times. So to be aware of that, to be aware how that influence in your life and either make it work for you as far as your occupation or profession is something to think about. So that's the piece on endings. I really like this book. and I'll end it on the endings piece because it's a good way to end it. I hope you found that clearly timing matters. I think we all know that, but I think throughout our day we're less conscious of it than we would possibly be, and hopefully by reading this book and listening to this podcast, you'll become more conscious of it, and maybe timing matters a lot, and some of it is out of our control. But if we understand and use some of the discoveries in this book, we may, be more conscious of it and use it to our advantage. And I guess that's my hope. And I kind of find these studies and looking at psychology and research, and some of it, like I said, is intuitive, that we've kind of had a sense of over time, but to actually see that this actually occurs, and maybe there's some things that are surprising about it, and just to be more conscious of it and realize how important it is. We may brush it off, but to realize how important it is and how much it can impact our lives, I think is kind of worthwhile to think about. So I hope you really enjoyed this podcast. I hope it wasn't too disparate. It's kind of an interesting topic, but harder one to kind of pull together and really talk about, because there's different aspects of it that he covers in the book. Again, I highly recommend the book. I think it's an enjoyable, easy, quick read that kind of summarizes this and puts it into different perspectives and covers many different topics that I haven't covered here. So thanks for listening again, and we'll talk to you on the next podcast. Thanks.